brings us to, one of the topics that we're talking about today, other than infinite regression, which I think we've implicitly already discussed, is I guess there's something and nothing in there, like why do we have any pieces at all? And evidently we do. We're here talking about having edge pieces or any pieces. And then I guess the edge pieces, in their nature of being edge pieces, are what we might call a necessary existence, something that necessarily exists for things to also exist, the contingent things to also exist.
Yeah, one way of thinking about that is as kind of things that are self-sufficient, so that don't rely on anything other than themselves to be what they are. Or also, and this is a formulation that I'm quite fond of, is something that cannot be other than what it is, So although this is, an analytic truth like 2 + 2 = 4 gives us a sense of what it is, although that's probably not in itself a foundational sort of necessity, but it's, the way that, what makes that true, 2 + 2 = 4? Well, it's true by definition. If you were to change the pieces, then it wouldn't be what it is anymore. So just the very nature of it means that it can't possibly be false. It can never be other than what it is. It's a kind of like a static identity or something like that.
Right. And these kind of necessary a priori truths, they have other properties as well, like they're tautological, and like if you think about 2 + 2 = 4, for example, the 4 is just 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, and the 2 is just 1 + 1, and the 2 + 2 is 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. So it's all it kind of re-expressing the same things in different ways. And the equal sign again is kind of like the necessary link between two things. And that's the like you said, it's kind of like a general form as opposed to that particular tautological truth being the outer piece. But there's something necessarily relatable between the outer piece and the inner pieces that make that link the same. So that the necessary existence of an outer piece will give a shape to the inner pieces. And like you said, you take the outer pieces and then you have, it's much easier to then figure out where the inner pieces go because you've got that shape.
Well, yeah, and not just that, but if you didn't have outer pieces and the puzzle just went on forever, it's not clear how you'd ever figure out what the whole picture was. Would there even be a whole picture at that point? It's hard to imagine how those pieces could then go together to make some kind of discrete image if there's no stopping point where, sort of you get to the frame of the picture and that sort of, if there's nowhere to orient around, no fixed point of reference, for composing the whole thing, it's hard to see how you could ever pull out of that a picture that makes sense, except, say, to just kind of make it up and say, oh, that looks like pictures in the clouds, oh, that looks like this, that looks like that.
Well, maybe there's a couple of questions I'd like to ask then. Is what's wrong with just having an infinite middle piece puzzle which goes on forever?
I mean, apart from, so the notion of an infinite regression is regarded by many, many philosophers as being a problematic sort of, and any kind of explanation that appeals to that structure is seen to be problematic. We usually think of that as indicating that something's gone wrong in the chain of reasoning. But the problem becomes particularly acute, I think, when we're talking about existence or contingency, dependency, causality. So usually the problem is, well, we're asking questions about the way the world works, and to enter into an infinite regression. I mean, we're finite creatures. We only have a finite amount of time. There's only a finite amount of steps that we can actually do in any kind of argument. So if we're looking for an explanation for something and the explanation involves an infinite regression, we kind of start getting the feeling like, oh, we're never getting the explanation. Like, in some sense, there is no explanation, or whatever the explanation is, it's tied up in this thing that is impossible to rationalize or conceptually engage with. But with dependency or contingency specifically, there seems to be a problem in terms of why anything would exist at all. So the usual idea of an infinite regression on a cosmological scale as well, the way things are now was caused by sort of events or facts sort of before, right? So you go backwards in time, and the further you go back, each step, determines the one that's closer to now. And you keep going back, and then thought is, well, why can't you just keep going back forever?
Mm.
And the problem with that is, well, so if the existence of things now, if the things that exist now exist only because they're made to exist by the prior link in the chain, and that chain only exists because of the prior link in the chain, and then that goes on forever, why does the chain exist, right? Like, why should there be any, if there's not a stopping point for existence to start coming down the line to begin with, why would there be, how does the, let's say the farthermost back one that we can just pick arbitrarily one, and you say, well, there's more before that making that exist. Okay, but why is this whole phenomenon going on in the first place? No individual link in the chain is capable of helping us understand why there should be a chain of causes or contingencies at all.
Right. So it's kind of like even if you were to frame in some kind of physicalist model, a kind of Big Bang, Big Bounce scenario, let's say, where there was an infinite number of Big Bangs that kept coming and big crunches that kept, like a cyclical universe, which would technically allow for sort of an infinite causal chain that didn't go or didn't ask for a kind of more fundamental outside piece explanation. So even if you had that, it would still be problematic in that you don't know why the universe exists in the first place, or why that process is happening in the first place, or what causes it, where it's held.
Yeah. So I mean, in a cyclical infinite chain, I think is at least more obviously sensible than an infinite chain just going back forever, because at least you can make sense of the fact that, well, the state kind of in some sense oscillates between a number of options, but like you said, at that point there's just no reason. We're not given an explanation for why there is a system of such a nature in the first, and that's actually what we were asking when we asked, well, how come this is here? How come that's here? How come things are as they are? Or why do things exist? So to go back and then have it loop around, you're struck by the impression that you've not received an explanation. This is just, whatever it is, it's very queer. It's very strange. We don't really understand. We're not left with an understanding.
Well, maybe someone taking on sort of devil's advocate for that position, what makes you think we can even find the why?
What makes me think we can find the why? I mean, we have a track record, I suppose, of being able to figure out things. I mean, historically, the scope of things we understood was much narrower, and there have always been people who've sort of said, well, it's a mystery, because you can't know. But historically, what the trend that we've seen is more and more we push back that veil of mystery, the sort of range of things that are attributed to, say, God's hand, or God, sort of the sort of mysterious, inexplicable nature of things and ineffable beyond our minds. The historical trend is that we push that back more and more. We close those gaps. We fill in our picture of the world with more and more detail. And I guess my thought is an inductive one. Who's to say that we can't? Like, in terms of how do I know that we can? I don't really. But I suppose my thought is that why not try? Like, there's no harm in trying. And it seems we're here after all, we've got to find something to do. And trying to come up with an explanation for how come things exist? I mean, that's an exciting prospect, you know. It seems like it could provide us with, I don't know, a very illuminating set of revelations about, I suppose, what we are, our place in the cosmic or ontological scheme, and our
Mm.
purpose for being here, you know?
Yeah, there's something exciting there as well, which touches on some of the intentions for this channel and kind of what excites me about um, divining an ontology that seems to be rational and fit.
Mhm.
And yeah, and that is the kind of a unification theory and a framework for, like, with that edge piece analogy in mind, it's kind of like knowing what the edge pieces are may give us a clue about how to do the middle pieces well. Like,
Yeah.
how do we frame them in such a way that we do find true answers or more true answers? And that could be applied not just in physics, but in psychology and economics and personal development. Like, there's so many
Yeah. Yeah.
different areas that we can then, I don't know, make more sense of with these edge pieces.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to extend that analogy, because I really do, I think that's a very apt analogy, the puzzle metaphor. But to
It's
extend it,
working
you
for
know,
us.
yeah, it's often thought, you know, that there's a problem in physics because our theories of relativity and our theories of quantum physics don't go together. And I think part of that, the reason for that is that a lot of the theorists are looking for a way to directly interface one with the other. You know,
Mm. Yeah.
the thing that a frame does, and you get this sometimes with a puzzle. You know, you kind of can kind of make out the pieces. You're like, oh, this it's got to go together here somewhere. You know,
Mm-hmm.
but having that edge piece means that one of those two sort of partial, you sort of fit together 5 or 6 different pieces. One of those partial things then fits into the edge. And if you can get the other one to fit into the edge, you're like, oh, look at that. There's actually like 2 or 3 pieces in the middle here that we're missing.
Mm.
What could those be? Rather than thinking, oh, these are going to mesh directly with one another. Or maybe there's
Right.
only one piece missing here and we just had to come up with that one missing link. It could well be that there's more than that. And you get a sense of proportion by
Mm.
connecting each of the sort of works in progress that you have up with that outer frame, because that gives you, it's like an anchor. You're then anchored. You're like, okay, this has to go here. This has to go here. So we know now there's sort of 3 or 4 pieces in the middle here. We just thought, you know, maybe there was one missing, but no, it's more than that.
Mm. Yeah. No, I like that as well. I'd like to quickly come back to the question of what makes us think that we can know.
Yeah.
Because I definitely get the sense of a lot of people, especially people who are, in the modern era of rejecting religion, rejecting kind of new age beliefs, and they're like, I need something rational and rigorous, and I need something to, make sense in the frameworks of my favorite make sense making people in the world, whether it's scientists or physicists or whatever. So what is the form of an explanation that would be satisfying for a modern kind of rational human, do you think?
That's a really good question. Um, kind of, I generally think it's got to be naturalistic. And
Mm-hmm.
that is not appealing to anything sort of supernatural over and above the kinds of things we might expect to find in nature. I think it's probably got to be have a reductive quality to it. So you explain more complicated phenomena by appealing to simpler parts. There's a building up, kind of
Mm.
organic emerging. Yeah, it's got to have that emergent quality where complexity arises organically out of the interactions of an aggregation of simplicity. Um, and I think just the nature of the project means that it's more likely to be abductive probably than deductive or inductive. So abductive means it's what's called the inference to the best explanation, right? Where deductive is sort of you have premises and ideally a logically valid argumentative structure, and if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed. Inductive is sort of you work from observable instances and you kind of infer a rule that would explain how come you got all the instances that you have. Abductive, on the other hand, sort of is a way of asking ourselves, okay, so this is all the information we have. What would have to be true in order to explain how come we can observe this data? So not like what rule would result in the specifics of the instances that we have, but more like what would need to be true for things like this to have come to be in the first place, kind of thing.
Can we use the puzzle to help us explore this, just for folks at home that aren't familiar with these terms of logic?
Sure. So I think the abductive explanation is like looking for the edge pieces, kind of saying, okay, in order to make sense of this picture, there have to be kind of general things, right? And what we're looking for is the collection of the general thing, or the organization of the general things that looks like it would be most apt to contain all the pieces that we can see.
Just to check, because that almost sounds like we're looking at, say, we've got bodies of knowledge that are represented by clusters of middle pieces that would be like, oh, there must be edge pieces because these middle pieces somehow make a shape that suggests an edge piece.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And deductive, I suppose, would be like, okay, we've got sort of three pieces, 1, 2, 3, and then deductive is like, okay, there's got to be a fourth piece here that fits directly into these other two sides that we've got. And we know because, the contours are like this, like it can't be other than this. Inductive would be more like, oh, hey, look, this sort of 4 or 5 pieces we have, this is starting to make a pattern looking at the actual surface of the shapes rather than the outline, the sort of edges.
Right. So in that case, you might have a piece that seems to fit with the other pieces, but then later on you realize that that's the wrong piece and there's another piece to fit in.
Exactly. And it involves kind of saying, okay, based on what the picture looks like, this is what the next piece is we're going to be looking for. So where deductive is like working out what the next piece is going to be based on the geometry of the piece, inductive is sort of based on the visual pattern on top of the piece. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think we did a good job of using that puzzle, keeping that puzzle analogy going.
Yeah. I know. I love that analogy, man. I think it's very, very apt.
Yeah.
So we talked a bit before about the edge pieces as sort of a necessary ground or something, that cannot be other than it is. And that obviously sort of pivots on the rejection of an infinite regression, that you can't just keep working outwards and putting these puzzle pieces together in that way forever. And I mean, obviously people know from their own experience solving a puzzle, well, A, that's not how puzzles work, and B, that is to work outwards and never to have any edges. And B, if it were, it's hard to see how you would know that you were making progress, for example, or that there was even a picture to be found. But one example I really like to use when showing the problematic nature of an infinite regression, which of course you, Alexander, will be well familiar with by now, is the sniper analogy. And I think this really shows the problem with, oh, well, why can't we just keep going backwards in time and say, well, the thing prior causes the thing that's closer, and so on and so on. Like, what's the problem with that? And part of the problem with that, I think, is exemplified in this analogy. So say you have a sniper, and the sniper has sort of got eyes on an important political target or a military target, he's ready to fire. The thing is, though, he can't make the call himself to take the shot. He's got to sort of ask his superior officer, the person who's immediately above him in the chain of command. He's got to sort of ask for permission. So he, radios into his immediate superior, and he's like, okay, I've got eyes on, can I take the shot? And his superior says sort of, well, just hold on a second, because I've also got to check, that I've got permission, because this is an important shot. So, I've also got to check, and I'll just radio into my superior. And the thing is, his superior also has to check with his superior, and so on, right? And so the general thought is, well, if that goes on forever, does the shot ever get fired? And I think the intuition most people have is, well, no. And the reason that this exposes the problem is the shot getting fired relies on it reaching a point where the authority can start to propagate back down the chain, right? And unless there's a stopping point, where it turns around and starts to propagate back down the chain, then the shot never gets fired. And the analogy for that is, well, unless there's something at the bottom which is necessarily existent, that is capable then of propagating existence down a chain of contingencies, how does, like, the chain going backwards doesn't seem to make sense of the idea of conferring existence onto the more proximate links in the chain, because it doesn't have existence itself. Like, no, the further back you go, the less existence you have. It just, there's nothing to give existence to any of it, as sort of the idea.